What's up, guys? It is October 20th, 10:26 a.m. And this is going to be the second scenario to the world after the pandemic in this series that we've been doing since yesterday. We're going to cover all four scenarios. If you haven't seen the video from yesterday, we cover a new renaissance in that one. And for today, we're going to go over have and have nots. So for the have and have not scenario 2, for how the world will be after, the recovery and the reset after the pandemic, it says in 2020, in the fall of 2020, the COVID pandemic is still raging. After the election, an exhausted population accepts severe restrictions of freedom in order to fight the virus. The elderly remain quarantined until July of 2021 so that the economy can reopen. An emergency executive order validated by the Supreme Court allows surveillance and tracking of cell phones, app data, and social media posts in order to minimize the COVID spread. Governments around the world have responded to the second wave by closing borders again, and the U.S. administration imposes a complete ban on immigration. ICE deports 7 million immigrants, sparking protests in Los Angeles and New York City. But under the new rules of the COVID Prevention Act, federal forces intervene to quell protests. With these new powers, the government can also quell racial unrest. The economy starts to reopen. The upper classes can afford the protective gear and experimental treatments that by the winter are becoming available, so the epidemic moves to poorer populations, especially communities of color. The economy reopening generates a burst of activity and a moderate sense of economic optimism, especially among the well-to-do. Government stimulus packages give people some spending money and sales start to reactivate. COVID provides a new excuse for voter suppression, and during and after the election, social unrest is rampant. The results are contested and violent clashes erupt in many cities. This is crazy. I really want to see exactly when they wrote this. I would assume they wrote it before 2020 if this is or even in 2020 if they're doing a scenario of how things play out. So 2021. So by 2021, civil unrest has become an intermittent feature of all major American cities, but now the government has ample power to repress mass protests by force if needed. Crime, fear of disease, and unrest spur many people to move to the suburbs, reversing much of the urban resurgence from previous decades. The wealthy increasingly lived in gated communities with private security, education, sanitation, and health services. Those that do not live in a private neighborhood tend to live in racially and socially homogeneous communities, and people drastically reduce interaction with other demographic groups. In some states, residential communities called whitopias emerge. These towns exist to defend the values of whiteness. Calls to expand Medicare and Medicaid in the pandemic are rejected, with determines that many Americans need to face the ongoing pandemic without medical insurance. The management of the stimulus package results in a windfall for major corporations, which has definitely happened. Despite the public resentment that ensues, large companies bounce back and start rehiring people. Stocks of major companies recover, rallying the markets. But another result of this process is an unprecedented concentration of wealth. Small businesses, from hair salons to neighborhood restaurants, cannot survive the COVID crisis and are swallowed by big companies. The salary gap between executives and workers increases dramatically. By mid-2021, new anti-libel laws gain approval with minor amendments by the Supreme Court, significantly muzzling the president's most vocal critics and forcing much of the opposition media semi-underground. People fearfully start limiting political posts on social media and try not to talk politics. In general, self-censorship is rampant. It's widely seen as unpatriotic to criticize the reconstruction efforts of the government. The COVID vaccine, which starts to become available in February 2021, is given first to the rich, then to healthcare workers, then to the elderly, and finally to the rest of the population. Glitches in the system delay the rollout, but as a significant portion of the population eventually receives the vaccine, although it is an out-of-pocket expense, with neither Medicaid nor Medicare covering the costs. In the third quarter of 2021, a new tax break passes in Congress, paving the way for greater accumulation of wealth by the highest earners. The markets react favorably and reach pre-COVID levels. Employment rises steadily and millions of jobs are created. At the same time, to aid job creation, Congress eliminates the federal minimum wage. Despite the fast recovery, trust in institutions is an all-time low. Americans distrust not just institutions, but one another, and being a prepper, extreme survivalist seems cool. Borders are now open for international travel, but people are still reluctant to do so. Despite widespread vaccination, fear is pervasive. The Christmas holidays of 2021 to 2022 sees very little international travel, especially because green card holders can now be denied entry when they return to the US. There we go. So now we go into 2022. Whew. Conspiracy theories about the origin of COVID have gone mainstream. With anti-Semitism and xenophobia at levels never seen in America, Jews and other minorities retreat to their own communities. Communal spaces are safe havens where people find warmth and meaning. Many rediscover the joy of community, and as people seek meaning after the pandemic, religious studies soar, including experimental spiritual rituals. We also see a renewal of the arts despite the covert censorship. With fewer journalistic outlets, the educated classes turn instead to reading poetry and literary fiction, which both see a revival. The Pew Report on the American Family of June 2022 shows that the rate of divorce is down. Adult children are living with their parents longer, and grandparents are increasingly seen as part of the nuclear family. It appears that after the quarantine, Americans have relearned the importance of family. Family also becomes a central issue in popular culture, and the happy family of the 1950s becomes the model to aspire to. Many workers continue to telecommute even after the quarantine. The prevalence of working from home further fuels the exodus to the suburbs. Parents have more time to spend at home, and childhood and teenage anxiety decreases. Paradoxically, while misogyny is mainstream, at home there is a new spousal equality as parents share more domestic chores and childcare, something they learned to do during the quarantine. Schools and universities never go back to normal. Online learning continues advancing by leaps and bounds. By 2022, Zoom Learn is the preferred platform for most educational institutions. By the 2022-2023 academic year, many regard a traditional college experience as an unnecessary luxury, and half of the residential campuses have closed. Outside the Ivy League, online college becomes a norm, and it is much more affordable than the in-person experience that preceded it. AI also continues to advance. The ban on immigration deprives many economic sectors, economy of badly needed workers, especially in healthcare. Robots do jobs once filled by immigrants, machines measure vital signs, drones deliver mail, and Ubers drive themselves. The economy becomes even more efficient as red tape and legal process simplified dramatically during the pandemic. AI moves into more areas of the economy. By late 2022, for example, medical prescriptions are submitted via a kiosk transmitted directly to the pharmacy and delivered by drone, all without human intervention. Studies deem the quality of computer diagnosis to be 23% superior compared to those made by actual doctors. The intensive use of AI means that privacy has all but disappeared. Employers now check applicants' medical records before hiring, and it is legal to monitor employees' activities through cell phone tracking even outside of work hours. There is some criticism of this phenomenon, but even Libertarian Senator Rand Paul admits that it's too late now to unscramble those eggs. Now we go to 2023. In 2023, a plan to renew American infrastructure is launched. Although the project is designed to benefit contractors and companies close to the government, it transforms much of the country's aging infrastructure. It seems the perfect launchpad for the presidential campaign. Large masses, however, feel neglected and left behind, including the increasingly angry Generation Z that sees its dreams and hopes dashed. Gen Zers feel they are never going to achieve the same standard of living that their parents enjoyed. A new source of unrest, maybe even revolution, is quietly brewing. So conspiracy, xenophobia, and AI, economic recovery and divisions. By 2023, the U.S. economy has finally recovered. The stock market and employment have bounced back up. At the same time, the country is more divided than ever. Inequality has risen dramatically and social cohesion has all but disappeared. How did we get there? And that is how right there. So I'm now going to go into the next scenario where we're going to dive into back to the 1930s. So let's see what this scenario entails. The economy doesn't recover. We're in a long depression, and simultaneously the society is fragmented, even violent. Inequality rises. The economic crisis fuels extremist movements, and society approaches the breaking point. All right. So economic depression, violence, fragmentation, and family refuge. By 2023, America is reminiscent of 1930s Europe. Long economic depression takes an enormous toll on the country, and the society fragments and divides. Many hoped that by the summer of 2020, the virus will be under control and the economy will start its recovery. However, the autumn wave of the virus is even more deadly than the first and lasts through the winter. An antiviral treatment remains elusive and the vaccine takes longer to develop than expected. All throughout 2021, there are different waves of the pandemic. The recurring waves prevent the economy from recovering, with staggering unemployment continuing through 2021. Roughly 1 in 5 Americans is looking for work and salary levels are plummeting. The cycle continues until the vaccine is finally confirmed and available in 2022. Well, at least we know that it's likely not this scenario because we already seen the vaccine roll out way long ago. But there is probably bits and pieces from each scenario that are playing out. Maybe there's like a hybrid scenario that we can come up with at the end. But 2020 to 2021, before losing his re-election bid, President Trump tries to jumpstart the economy, but that produces staggering amounts of debt, and America's economy is now structurally weak. The transfer of power to the Biden-Harris ticket takes place. In the fall of 2020, we see the beginning of a wave of political violence that will engulf America. Dude, I gotta see when they wrote, maybe I can see right here. Updated October 2020. Updated October 2020. Wow. Okay. So now we know the date all this came out. It was updated October 2020. So before losing re-election, okay. So in the fall of 2020, we see the beginning of a wave of political violence that will engulf America. Far-right movements refuse to acknowledge the authority of the federal government, while popular discontent with the economic situation gives rise to violent socialist protests, which demand a redistribution of wealth. The government tries to navigate a middle way. While immigration remains closed, universal health care passes. An enacted fiscal reform measure heavily taxes the wealthy, but that fails to curb the growing deficit. The field of artificial intelligence fares relatively well in the crisis as more technological tools develop for remote learning, healthcare, and retail businesses. Throughout 2021, technology companies prevent an even more severe slump of the Dow Jones. Urban violence and fear of contagion spurs many who have the means to move to the suburbs. The rich live in gated communities with private security, education, and sanitation services. The urban resurgence of the last 2 decades is halted in reverse. Remote work becomes the norm even during the waves when the virus is under control, further exacerbating the geographic divide between urban and suburban populations. After the long months of isolation, many people feel a greater appreciation of family, seeing their homes as refuges from the uncertainty of the outside world. However, the prolonged economic crisis puts families under great stress, and resulting psychological illnesses become more pervasive. In this context, people resort to faith communities for spiritual, social, and even financial support. While the broader society faces dissolution, smaller communities thrive as they become a haven and a refuge in an uncertain world. Many compared the situation to that of the early 1900s when mutual aid societies mushroomed. More and more people rely on credit unions and cooperatives instead of big banks, which are widely viewed as being predatory and unfair. Now we go into 2022. Some communities see their world upended by COVID. There's also a flood of experimentation and new forms of social organization. Urban communes and agricultural cooperatives emerge. These groups provide both well-being and meaning to growing numbers of Americans. Travel remains rare and few Americans can afford it. The new American Airlines, which was nationalized by the government after the collapse of the industry, offers subsidized travel, but there are not many takers. During the COVID crisis, the education sector transforms. By the 2022 academic year, enrollment in residential colleges had plummeted to 40% of the 2019 level. Commuter colleges and online education soars, and 85% of students attend state schools. While everybody suffers in this crisis, the depression disproportionately affects the poor. Despite the new government's redistributive policies, economic inequality keeps growing as the wealthy can better protect their assets and income. The midterm elections of 2022 see the rise of both the far left and the far right. Proud Christian nation and socialism and justice rhetoric monopolizes debates, which often erupt into arguments and fistfights. 2023 is reminiscent of 1932 Europe. Many see democracy as incapable of solving America's problems and instead turn to totalitarian options. In spite of, or perhaps because of this, there's a political excitement and revolutionary energy not seen since the 1960s. Generation Z, whose dreams were obliterated by the Depression, leads the charge in demanding change, but without moderate leaders, protests turn violent and even deadly. At the same time, moderates are not hopeless. A new centrist party is starting to emerge as an alternative in the 2024 elections. While at first, this third way fails to excite the masses, more and more people coalesce around its ideas. Very interesting stuff. So very interesting. So now let's go into the final scenario. A smaller but tastier pie. So the economy doesn't recover, but the smaller pie is distributed more equitably. The society has learned to exercise solidarity, and a new spirit of cohesion has emerged from the pandemic. We are poor but seem to be happier. So depressed economy and stock markets, yet signs of unity, new social norms, and healthier communities. By 2023, a series of structural reforms spurred by the COVID crisis have transformed much in the country, while the economic crisis is pervasive and long-lasting. A better distribution of wealth and a stronger safety net make life easier and happier for many Americans. So late 2020 to 2021. During the fall, both the virus and social unrest are rampant. The Biden administration has to contend with the economic fallout of the crisis, the continuing isolation caused by COVID, and increased violence from far-right extremists. The violence, however, is quelled, and by 2021, despite the ongoing pandemic, some signs of normalcy start to appear. There's a consensus that America suffers unnecessarily high rates of infection and death, and the majority of people recognize the need for a universal healthcare system. Healthcare for all passes in early 2021, replacing the Affordable Care Act with a single payer system in each of the 50 states. Central to the new system is the development of network community healthcare centers that transform how primary healthcare is delivered and insured. Revenue from new corporate carbon, luxury, and estate taxes help extend the payout of unemployment benefits beyond the original 26 weeks that were the norm before the coronavirus. The Green New Deal drives new infrastructure investments in public transit, improvement/upgrades of the electrical grid, development of innovative technologies to reduce plastics waste, and to create relocation opportunity zones to reduce crowding in urban environments. While initially opposed by many, by late 2021, the effects of these reforms are starting to be appreciated. A more collaborative approach between the federal government and the states determines that when the virus hits again in early 2021, the two spheres coordinate on all facets of the response, including declaring emergency response acts. Testing is readily available, and the governors take charge of allocating scarce resources. Despite the optimism of the early fall of 2020, the vaccine is not ready to be fully deployed until late 2021. In the rush to produce a vaccine quickly, laboratories cut corners, and the vaccine is not deemed to be safe and effective until more testing is conducted. Paradoxically, the success in containing the outbreaks means that vaccines can't be tested as easily due to the lack of critical mass of contagion. While 2021 is a tough year, people feel safer than before and they trust the government response. Also, social tensions and unrest decrease, and a new sense of solidarity of we are all in this together emerges. Now we go into 2022. By 2022, both parties are campaigning on American values of justice, compassion, and freedom for all. Surprisingly, the Better Together Society legislation passes with bipartisan support. It portends a new era of smaller yet sustainable living for all, which recognizes the continued threat of pandemics and the need to re-envision American life. Urban and suburban planning goes into hyperdrive to decrease population density and pollution, promote responsible and more local food consumption, and add more green space and gardens. The High Line in New York and the Salesforce Park in San Francisco becomes models of how to repurpose and reinvent green spaces in urban environments. A vaccine becomes available and goes into full-scale production in mid-2022, but continued shortages due to manufacturing glitches means that only individuals over age 60 or in certain high-risk professions have access to it. Corona outbreaks continue to occur around the world. International travel is constrained and global trade, particularly manufacturing, remains limited. The economy continues to suffer, and recovery runs in a stop-and-go pattern. With international trade and real wages down, however, there's an unforeseen benefit. Traditional manufacturing jobs return to the U.S. The slow rollout of the vaccine has meant that social distancing and limited gatherings remain in effect. This creates a new focus on local communities, neighborhoods, and reliance on extended family and traditional community institutions. Maintaining small gatherings requires that school, houses of worship, summer camps, and events all be smaller. These limits also necessitate new organizational models of collaboration and cooperation. And then it goes into to lower the unemployment rate. Many states offer financial incentives to encourage young adults to stay in college for an extra year or two, especially if they are willing to pursue degrees in areas where there remain significant shortages: computer and environmental sciences, teaching, and mental health. The unmet demand for healthcare workers spurs new taxpayer-subsidized incentives to attract people to the field, such as a hardship pay, tuition assistance, loan forgiveness, and housing. Telemedicine for non-emergency care is now the norm. Many people who are able to do so continue to work remotely. The digital divide that existed pre-COVID remains severe until philanthropists, industry, and government collaborate to make high-speed internet connections accessible to low-income and other underserved communities. Social distancing, remote work, educational disruptions, and a new gig economy generates innovative digital solutions for knowledge gathering, sharing, and actual experiences. Not surprisingly, ubiquitous digital and video technology and remote service delivery in turn generate complicated new legal discussions and decisions around privacy, fake news, and online speech. The Supreme Court is set to hear a landmark case about the publishing of Zoom transcripts, where the record button was visibly on, but participants were not explicitly notified. This case starts a domino effect of regulation targeting the tech industry. Many professionals who were furloughed during the initial quarantine are not rehired into their prior positions. Instead, they become contract workers, spurring the formation of a gig workers union, which is now the country's second largest union after the NEA. By 2023, the pace of life has slowed down. Patterns of consumption and limits on travel keep people close to home, and some people are even growing their own food and making their own clothing. As people have more time to think, the quest for purpose and meaning takes on new levels of importance. The hope now is that the economy will heal, albeit at a lower level of GDP than before the coronavirus hit, but can begin to add new jobs and stability to individual and family life. Yet the GDP growth is not seen as the most important goal. Policies are now oriented towards a better, not a wealthier life, and people seem to be happy with the change, preferring a slower but more equitable recovery. Local communities have strengthened during the travel restrictions thanks to the buy and live local motto. There is a widespread search for spirituality, and every religion sees many seekers, people looking for community, belonging, and meaning. At the same time, there's a growing sense of a common destiny for all Americans, helped in part by the new national service law that obliges every young person to serve the country for a year, either in the military or in community work. In all, by 2023, we are poorer, humbler, and happier. So it's kind of like the World Economic Forum video that I shared yesterday, and about how you're going to own nothing and be happy about it in a sense. That's basically this scenario that they're laying out. And yeah, so those are all the scenarios. And I do see kind of parts from each of them that seem likely to happen. I was in the boat of thinking that even before coming across this, that we're entering a new renaissance. And I believe that how this is going to play out is we're going to experience the roaring 20s, but in the 2000s instead of 1920s. So I believe we're in the stage of, from 2020 to 2030, all these new innovative technologies coming out are going to really kickstart our world into this new phase. And it's going to actually turn out to be a huge recovery, and society will come out on top on this, and the world will go through good times again from like 2020 to say like 2027. And then I believe around 2027, 2030 will be the start of a shift where we're going to see maybe the Great Depression type scenario play out back to the 1930s, where like we start off with this, then we go to this. Maybe it's like an actual kind of order of events. We have this, then we go to this, then we go to that. And then that's at the end of it all, this is where we end up. That could be the case, but this is where I think we're at. I think by 2023, America is going to experience a mini golden age, not only as the economy bounce back and surpass pre-COVID levels, but also the polarization and inequalities of society have diminished markedly. Americans enter this new year with a booming economy and a healthier, more cohesive society than 3 years earlier in May 2020, at the height of the COVID pandemic. It would have been hard to foresee the situation, but the world got a lucky break. And that's where we're kind of at now. Like, this seems like there's no way, like everything is falling and burning around us right now. And it does seem like a very hard foreseen situation to happen. But all it takes is one announcement, one kind of event to really just change course here, and for people to see the light through all this darkness. And I think we're going to get a lucky break. I mean, it's kind of pie in the sky to throw that out there right now with everything going on, but I just have a feeling, and just through things that I've seen, that maybe we're not going to go through this big crash, depression now. Maybe it's going to play out 100 years from 1929, the Great Depression. Maybe because everything lined up, like the Spanish flu, I think it was 1919. And then C-19 came 2019. And then maybe now we're going to enter into the phase of the roaring 20s, like 1920s, but now it's 2020s. And then by the end of this decade, where all these initiatives go into place, like all these sustainable development goal, 2030, agenda 2030, all these stuff, when those go into place, then that Great Depression type scenario that happened back in 1929 now happens 100 years later, 2029. And yeah, that's what I'm seeing. That's what I'm thinking. That's what I think the scenario might be, because you can even see the reset button distortions in some prices from oil to big city rent are corrected. We've seen that happen. We're seeing that we had a Build Back Better program, and now it's like the Rebuild America or the new Green Deal, all these things that they were laying out. They even said here that about after the Black Death came the Renaissance, and after the Spanish flu, we had the Roaring 20s. Now we have the Great Renewal. I do believe that these cycles just play out over and over again. Macro cycles then play out into the micro cycles. And I do feel as if like we are going to go into a Roaring 20s phase. And yeah, so that's going to be it for this video. And that's it for these C19 scenarios. This is the Jewish Funders Network. I haven't dug into it, but I'm sure they're very tied up with some heavy hitters. But yeah, so you can actually go to the website, and then they have that document there if you wanted to go through it more and really keep this on deck so we can see this all play out. And we can kind of always resort to this as a resource to see if things are falling in line with whichever scenario it may be. So there we go. And then they have like things like, what do we need to do now to start preparing for the scenarios? And you can get prepped on that. And it talks about what's next here. So thinking of future scenarios can be unsettling. It requires open-mindedness and humility because it demands that we admit that there are many things about the future that we can't control. We realize that ultimately we cannot stop the tsunami of the future, but with the creativity and vision, we can learn how to surf it. So that's the goal here. We just got to learn how to surf it. Life will come at you, but as long as you can navigate it and adapt and just surf it, everything will be fine. So that's it for the video. I'm going to do a video today, a deep dive called The Holy Grail, and it's about XRP, cross-border payments, etc. So if you haven't subscribed already, subscribe so you can get notified of that video, as well as in the bio in this YouTube video. Go join the Discord. We have the automated signals here for all the cryptos. We have our group chat. We have the market updates get sent into here, the newsletters as well too. And yeah, so looking forward to seeing you guys there.